Hi, I'm Natalie Brooks. 3 weeks ago, my own sister walked into my company's HR department and filed a harassment complaint against me. She accused me of creating a hostile work environment, making inappropriate comments, and using my position to intimidate her. The HR director called me into his office, his face grave as he slid the formal complaint across his mahogany desk. My hands trembled as I read Vanessa's signature at the bottom, her accusations typed in clinical corporate language that made my stomach turn. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But here's what nobody in that room knew, not even Derek Martinez, my HR director who'd been with the company for 8 years. I'm not just another employee, I'm the CEO and founder of Horizon Digital Solutions, and this entire situation was exactly what I'd been planning for months. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in Conference Room B as Derek explained the investigation process to me, his voice professional but tinged with the awkwardness of discussing workplace harassment with someone he believed was just a marketing coordinator. I nodded at appropriate intervals, my heart pounding not from fear of losing my job, but from the realization that my own company's procedures were about to be tested in the most personal way possible. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very policies I'd spent countless hours crafting with our legal team were now being used to investigate a claim against their creator. 6 months earlier, I'd read a devastating article about a tech startup in California where multiple women had filed harassment complaints that were systematically buried by HR. The victims were gaslit, evidence was lost, and the perpetrators were quietly transferred or promoted. The story haunted me because it forced me to confront an uncomfortable question. If something similar happened at my company, would our procedures actually protect the victims, or would they protect the institution? I'd built Horizon Digital Solutions from the ground up, starting in my cramped studio apartment in Westlake Hills, with nothing but a laptop and a vision. We now employed over 200 people across 3 floors of a downtown Austin high-rise, and I realized I had no idea whether the HR policies we'd implemented were worth the paper they were printed on. The idea for the test came to me during a particularly heated board meeting where we were discussing our employee handbook updates. Marcus Chen, our legal counsel, was explaining the importance of robust anti-harassment policies, when board member Patricia Walsh interrupted to question whether we were being too cautious. "These policies are so strict," she'd complained, "that employees might abuse them to settle personal scores or gain leverage in workplace disputes." Her words stuck with me because they revealed a fundamental distrust of victims that I suspected might be more widespread than I wanted to admit. That night, I sat in my home office overlooking the Austin skyline, wondering how many companies talked about protecting their employees while simultaneously creating environments where victims felt afraid to come forward. The decision to involve Vanessa wasn't made light. My younger sister had always been theatrical, prone to dramatic gestures and emotional outbursts that made family gatherings feel like performance art. She'd struggled to find stable employment after college, bouncing between retail jobs and unsuccessful attempts at freelance graphic design. When she asked me for a position at Horizon, I'd hesitated for weeks before finally offering her a role in our content creation department. I knew mixing family and business was risky, but I also knew that Vanessa's tendency toward exaggeration and conflict would make her the perfect unwitting participant in my experiment. If our HR department could handle a complaint from someone with a personal relationship to the accused, someone with a history of dramatic behavior, then they could handle anything. The setup required months of careful planning. I created a false identity within the company's organizational structure, officially listing myself as Natalie Chen, a marketing coordinator who reported to our creative director. I worked with our IT specialist, Tyler Reed, to create a separate employee file, complete with fake references and a fabricated work history. Tyler thought we were conducting a security audit to test whether fake employees could be inserted into our payroll system. Only Lauren Hayes, my executive assistant and closest confidant at the company, knew the full scope of what I was planning. Lauren had worked with me since the company's early days and had seen firsthand how other organizations failed their employees. She understood why this test was necessary, even if she questioned my method. The morning Vanessa submitted her complaint, I was sitting in the company cafeteria we called the Hub, pretending to review marketing materials while actually watching Derek Martinez receive the paperwork from Casey Thompson, our lead HR investigator. Casey was someone I'd personally hired 2 years earlier, impressed by her background in employment law and her reputation for thorough, fair investigations. As I watched her examine Vanessa's complaint, I felt a mixture of pride and anxiety. Pride because Casey immediately began following our established protocols, but anxiety because I was about to discover whether those protocols were actually effective or just corporate theater. The complaint itself was a masterpiece of believable fiction that Vanessa and I had crafted together over several weeks. She alleged that I, as Natalie Chen, had made inappropriate comments about her appearance during team meetings, had criticized her work performance in front of colleagues in ways that seemed designed to humiliate her, and had used knowledge of her personal life gained through our family relationship to make her feel uncomfortable at work. The genius of these allegations was that they contained just enough truth to be plausible while being serious enough to trigger a full investigation. Vanessa had always been sensitive about her appearance. I had occasionally been critical of her work quality, and I certainly knew details about her personal life that could theoretically be used inappropriately. Derek's call to my apartment that evening felt surreal. I sat on my leather couch, phone pressed to my ear, as he explained in his careful professional tone that I was being placed on paid administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. "I want you to know, Natalie," he said, using my fake first name, "that we take all harassment complaints seriously at Horizon Digital Solutions. You'll receive full pay during the investigation, and we'll conduct a thorough and fair review of the allegation." I thanked him for his professionalism, my voice carefully modulated to sound like someone who was shocked but trying to remain composed. After hanging up, I walked to my kitchen window and stared out at the city lights, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. The first week of the investigation was excruciating. I couldn't go to my own office, couldn't attend meetings for the company I'd built, couldn't even access my work email without raising suspicion. Instead, I spent my days in coffee shops around Austin, nominally working on personal projects while actually monitoring my company's operations through Lauren. She kept me updated on the investigation's progress through coded text messages and brief phone calls made to sound like casual check-ins between friends. The hardest part was maintaining the charade with my family. Vanessa, committed to her role, would call me in the evenings to vent about the stress of being involved in a workplace harassment case, never breaking character even when we were alone. Casey Thompson's investigation was thorough in ways that both impressed and terrified me. She interviewed every member of our content creation team, reviewed email communications between Vanessa and me going back months, and even spoke with employees from other departments who might have witnessed our interaction. What struck me most was how seriously she took Vanessa's allegations, never once suggesting that my sister might be exaggerating or seeking attention. Casey treated the complaint with the gravity it deserved, which made me realize how many investigators probably failed victims by approaching their cases with skepticism rather than genuine concern. The interview process revealed disturbing patterns I hadn't anticipated. When Casey spoke with Kevin Walsh, a junior designer who worked closely with both Vanessa and my alter ego Natalie Chen, he initially seemed reluctant to discuss workplace dynamics. It took 3 separate conversations before he admitted that he'd witnessed what he described as tense interactions between us, but that he'd assumed it was normal workplace friction and hadn't thought to report it. His reluctance to speak up highlighted one of the fundamental flaws in many workplace harassment policies. They rely on bystanders to recognize and report problematic behavior, but most employees are either too afraid or too uncertain to get involved. During the second week, Casey requested a formal interview with me about the allegations. We met in a conference room at a neutral location, a law office downtown that Horizon sometimes used for sensitive discussion. I arrived early, sitting in the lobby and watching other people go about their business, wondering if any of them were dealing with workplace situations similar to what I was manufacturing. When Casey appeared, her professional demeanor was perfect, warm enough to encourage honesty but serious enough to convey the gravity of the situation. She began by explaining the investigation process, assuring me that I would have opportunities to respond to all allegations, and that the company was committed to reaching a fair conclusion based on evidence rather than assumption. Responding to Vanessa's specific allegations required a delicate balance. I needed to defend myself convincingly enough that the investigation felt genuine, but not so aggressively that I undermined the validity of harassment complaints in general. When Casey asked about the comments regarding Vanessa's appearance, I expressed confusion and concern, suggesting that any remarks I'd made were intended as professional feedback about presentation standards rather than personal criticism. I admitted that my communication style could sometimes be direct, but I emphasized that I'd never intended to create a hostile environment for anyone. The conversation felt like walking a tightrope between truth and fiction, knowing that every word was being recorded and would become part of the official investigation file. The most challenging moment came when Casey asked about my relationship with Vanessa outside of work. Company policy required employees to disclose family relationships, and my failure to do so as Natalie Chen was itself a policy violation that could justify disciplinary action. I feigned embarrassment, explaining that I'd been afraid that revealing our relationship would hurt Vanessa's chances of being hired on her own merit. This explanation was actually closer to the truth than most of my other responses, since I had genuinely worried that nepotism concerns would overshadow Vanessa's qualifications when I'd originally hired her. Casey made careful notes about this disclosure, and I could see her mentally cataloging it as another factor to consider in her final recommendation. As the investigation progressed, I began to see my company's culture through different eyes. Employees who I'd always considered engaged and communicative suddenly seemed guarded when discussing workplace dynamics. Several people mentioned in passing that they sometimes felt uncomfortable reporting concerns because they worried about being seen as troublemakers or facing retaliation. These admissions were devastating because they suggested that despite all our policies and training programs, we'd still created an environment where people felt afraid to speak up about problems. The irony that I was discovering these issues while pretending to be the subject of a harassment complaint wasn't lost on me. The financial implications of the investigation were also eye-opening. Casey's time, Derek's oversight, the cost of the external law firm providing neutral meeting space, and my continued salary during administrative leave were adding up to tens of thousands of dollars. For a smaller company, a single harassment investigation could represent a significant financial burden, which explained why some organizations might be tempted to rush through the process or discourage complaints altogether. This realization made me appreciate the privilege of being able to afford a thorough investigation, while also highlighting how economic pressures could compromise justice in less well-funded workplaces. Lauren's updates during this period painted a picture of a company struggling with uncertainty. Employees knew that someone was under investigation for harassment, but the deliberate confidentiality of the process meant that rumors and speculation were filling the information vacuum. Some people assumed the worst about the accused employee, while others questioned whether the complainant might be seeking attention or trying to cause trouble. These reactions revealed how harassment allegations could fracture workplace communities, creating divisions and suspicions that persisted long after investigations concluded. Even when policies worked perfectly, the human cost of workplace harassment extended far beyond the immediate participant. The waiting was the hardest part. During my forced administrative leave, I found myself questioning every decision I'd ever made as a leader. Had I unknowingly created conditions that made harassment more likely? Were there other employees who'd experienced problems but felt unable to report them? Was I so insulated by my position as CEO that I'd missed obvious signs of dysfunction in my own organization? These questions consumed my thoughts during long walks around Austin's downtown area, past the office building where my employees were continuing their work without knowing their leader was conducting an elaborate test of their workplace protection. 3 weeks into the investigation, Casey scheduled what she described as a final interview with me. The meeting felt different from our previous conversations, more formal and conclusive. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In suburban Phoenix, 43-year-old Sarah Mitchell discovered an old photograph that would unravel her entire reality. What began as spring cleaning became a journey into her past when she noticed something impossible in the background. Before we continue, drop a comment if you've ever experienced déjà vu. She began by summarizing the investigation's findings, explaining that she'd interviewed 12 employees, reviewed hundreds of emails and documents, and carefully considered all available evidence. Her thoroughness was impressive, but I could see the weight of the responsibility in her eyes. She was about to make a recommendation that would significantly impact multiple people's lives and careers, based on allegations that I knew were fabricated, but that she had every reason to believe were genuine. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Casey asked about my long-term goals with the company and whether I felt supported by management in my professional development. Her questions suggested that she was considering the broader context of workplace dynamics rather than just the specific allegations, which impressed me as an investigator, but terrified me as someone whose deception was becoming increasingly elaborate. I found myself giving honest answers about feeling valued and supported, which were true in my real role as CEO, but felt strange in the context of pretending to be a harassment-accused employee seeking vindication. As Casey concluded the interview, she explained that she would be preparing her final report over the next few days, and that Derek Martinez would schedule a meeting to discuss the investigation's outcome. She thanked me for my cooperation throughout the process and emphasized that regardless of the findings, the company was committed to ensuring a safe and respectful workplace for everyone. Her professionalism and genuine concern for all parties involved made me feel both proud of the team I'd assembled and guilty about the deception I was perpetrating on someone who was clearly dedicated to doing the right thing. That evening, I sat in my home office, staring at the Austin skyline and contemplating the complexity of what I'd set in motion. The investigation had revealed both strengths and weaknesses in our procedures, highlighted gaps in our workplace culture, and forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about power dynamics and employee relations. But it had also shown me that we'd hired good people who took their responsibilities seriously, created policies that were generally effective when properly implemented, and fostered an environment where at least some employees felt safe reporting concern. The question now was whether the knowledge I'd gained justified the elaborate deception I'd used to obtain it, and what I would do with the insights the investigation had provided. Tomorrow would bring Casey's final report and Derek's decision about my employment as Natalie but tonight, I was just Natalie Brooks, CEO and founder of Horizon Digital Solutions, wondering whether the test I'd designed would ultimately strengthen or damage the company I'd spent years building. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier than it did in that moment, as I prepared to face the consequences of a plan that had seemed so logical in theory but felt increasingly reckless in practice. Whatever happened next, I knew that this investigation had changed not just my understanding of workplace harassment policies, but my entire perspective on what it meant to create truly safe and supportive environments for the people who trusted me with their careers and well-being. The call came at 7:30 on a Thursday morning, jolting me from a restless sleep where dreams of boardrooms and interrogation rooms had blended into a surreal nightmare. Derek Martinez's voice carried a formality that made my chest tighten, even though I knew this moment was inevitable. He requested my presence at the office at 10 o'clock to discuss the investigation's finding. The 2.5 hours between that call and the scheduled meeting stretched like a lifetime, filled with coffee that tasted like ash and a shower that couldn't wash away the growing sense that I'd unleashed something far more complex than I'd initially planned. I arrived at the downtown office building where I'd spent countless hours building my company, but today I felt like an outsider looking up at the glass tower that housed my life's work. The security guard, Marcus, greeted me with the same friendly nod he'd given me for years, completely unaware that I was about to walk into a meeting where my fictional employee persona would face judgment for allegations I'd orchestrated. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt interminable, each floor marking another step toward a confrontation that would determine whether my elaborate test had been worth the deception. Derek's office occupied a corner space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Austin cityscape. He'd decorated it with modern furniture and motivational artwork that suddenly felt like props in a corporate theater production. Casey Thompson sat across from his desk, a thick manila folder positioned between them like evidence in a trial. Their expressions were professionally neutral, but I could detect the weight of whatever conclusion they'd reached. Derek gestured for me to take the chair facing them both, and I settled into the familiar leather seat where I'd conducted countless meetings as CEO, now sitting as someone whose employment hung in the balance. Casey opened the folder and removed several documents, arranging them with the precision of someone who'd spent days preparing for this moment. Her investigation had been exhaustive in ways that both impressed and unnerved me. She'd documented every interaction between Vanessa and my alter ego, analyzed communication patterns in emails that stretched back months, and interviewed colleagues who'd provided perspectives I hadn't anticipated. The thoroughness of her work made me realize how many companies probably failed their employees not through malicious intent, but through investigations that lacked the resources or commitment to uncover the full truth. The findings were delivered with clinical precision that stripped away any emotional undertone. Casey explained that several employees had corroborated aspects of Vanessa's complaint, describing interactions they'd witnessed that could reasonably be interpreted as creating an uncomfortable work environment. Kevin Walsh had provided a particularly detailed account of a team meeting where my criticism of Vanessa's presentation had seemed disproportionately harsh, given that other employees making similar mistakes had received more constructive feedback. His observations stung because they contained enough truth to feel like legitimate criticism of my leadership style, even though the context was entirely fabricated. Derek supplemented Casey's presentation with his own analysis of the company's response to the situation. He praised the investigation's thoroughness while also acknowledging that the case had highlighted potential gaps in their training programs. Several employees had admitted during interviews that they weren't entirely clear on what constituted harassment versus normal workplace friction, suggesting that the company's educational efforts needed strengthening. These revelations were exactly what I'd hoped to uncover, but hearing them delivered as critiques of policies I'd personally approved felt like receiving a medical diagnosis I'd suspected but dreaded having confirmed. The most damaging evidence came from documentation I'd forgotten existed. Our IT systems automatically logged employee computer activity, and Casey had discovered that I'd accessed Vanessa's personnel file multiple times without clear business justification. As Natalie Chen, this behavior looked like someone using unauthorized access to gather information about a colleague's personal background. In reality, I'd been checking on Vanessa's performance metrics and attendance as her concerned employer, but Casey had no way of knowing this context. The discovery made me realize how easily innocent actions could appear sinister when viewed through the lens of harassment allegations. Casey's recommendation was delivered with the careful language of someone who understood the legal implications of every word. She concluded that while the evidence didn't definitively prove intentional harassment, the pattern of behavior described by multiple witnesses created a reasonable concern about workplace environment and professional conduct. Her suggestion was a formal disciplinary action that would include mandatory harassment training, a written warning placed in my personnel file, and a 6-month probationary period during which any additional complaints would result in immediate termination. The punishment was fair and measured, exactly the kind of response I'd hoped our policies would generate, but receiving it felt like being convicted of crimes I'd scripted myself. Derek's delivery of the decision carried the weight of someone who genuinely cared about doing the right thing for all involved parties. He explained that while the company valued my contributions and wanted to support my continued employment, maintaining a safe workplace environment had to be the top priority. His words echoed the training materials I'd personally approved, creating a strange circular experience where my own policies were being used to discipline my fictional persona. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was simultaneously proud of Derek's adherence to proper procedures and devastated by their application to my fabricated situation. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Derek asked about my relationship with Vanessa and how we might work together moving forward. His concern was genuine, reflecting a sophisticated understanding that harassment cases involving family members or close relationships required special consideration to prevent ongoing workplace tension. He suggested that one option might be transferring either Vanessa or me to different departments to minimize future conflicts, a reasonable solution that I hadn't fully considered when designing this test. The practical implications of maintaining my deception were becoming increasingly complex. Casey's final comments revealed insights that went far beyond the specifics of this case. She explained that harassment investigations often uncovered broader cultural issues within organizations, and that this situation had highlighted some areas where Horizon Digital Solutions could strengthen its workplace environment. Her observations about communication patterns, power dynamics, and bystander behavior were exactly the kind of systemic analysis I'd hoped to generate, but they also made me realize how much my experiment had disrupted the lives and comfort of innocent employees who'd been forced to participate in an investigation based on fictional premises. The meeting concluded with paperwork that formalized my disciplinary status and outlined the expectations for my continued employment. Signing documents that created an official record of harassment allegations against my fictional identity felt surreal, like participating in a bureaucratic ritual that had taken on a life of its own. Derek and Casey's professionalism throughout the process had been exemplary, but I could see the emotional toll that difficult personnel decisions exacted on conscientious managers who genuinely cared about their employees' well-being. Walking out of the office building after that meeting, I felt the full weight of what I'd accomplished and the cost it had required. The investigation had proven that our HR policies were fundamentally sound, that our investigators were thorough and fair, and that our managers were committed to creating safe workplace environments. But it had also revealed gaps in training, communication, and cultural awareness that needed immediate attention. More troubling was the realization that I'd obtained this knowledge by deceiving good people who'd invested their professional reputations in reaching conclusions based on fabricated evidence. The afternoon was spent in Café Luna on South Lamar, a coffee shop that had become my unofficial office during the administrative leave. I sat in a corner booth, laptop open but mostly ignored, processing the morning's revelations while watching Austin's creative class work on their own projects around me. The normalcy of the scene felt jarring after the intensity of the disciplinary meeting, as if I'd stepped from a corporate drama into a peaceful documentary about freelance professionals pursuing their passion. The contrast highlighted how much my experiment had consumed my thoughts and emotions over the past month. Lauren Hayes found me there around 4 o'clock, sliding into the booth across from me with the casual ease of someone who'd spent years serving as my closest confidant. Her expression mixed concern with curiosity as she waited for me to process the day's events. I explained the meeting's outcome in careful terms, mindful that even our private conversations needed to maintain the fiction that I was genuinely an employee facing discipline rather than a CEO conducting an elaborate organizational test. Lauren listened with the patient attention she'd always shown, asking thoughtful questions that helped me articulate the complex emotions surrounding the investigation's conclusion. The conversation gradually shifted from the specifics of my situation to broader questions about workplace harassment and organizational culture. Lauren shared observations about employee reactions to the investigation that I hadn't considered from my external perspective. Several team members had expressed concerns about the confidentiality of harassment complaints, worried that their willingness to provide honest feedback might become known to colleagues and create future workplace tension. These fears highlighted another unintended consequence of my experiment: the way investigation processes could create lasting anxiety among employees who participated in good faith. Lauren also revealed that Vanessa had confided her own concerns about the situation's impact on our family relationship. Despite her commitment to the role she was playing, my sister was struggling with the deception required to maintain the investigation's credibility. She'd mentioned feeling guilty about potentially damaging my reputation within the company, even though she understood the larger purpose behind our arrangement. Her emotional conflict added another layer of complexity to an experiment that had already proven far more challenging than I'd anticipated when conceiving the idea months earlier. As evening approached, I made the decision to visit our family home in Cedar Park, needing to process the day's events with the only person who fully understood what I was attempting to accomplish. The drive through Austin's suburbs provided time to think about the investigation's implications for my company and my leadership philosophy. The successful test had proven that our policies worked, but it had also forced me to confront uncomfortable questions about the methods leaders might use to evaluate their organizations and the ethical boundaries of workplace experimentation. Vanessa met me at the front door with an expression that mixed relief with apprehension. She'd been waiting for news about the investigation's outcome, knowing that its conclusion would determine whether our elaborate deception had achieved its intended goal. We sat in the living room where we'd planned this experiment months earlier, the familiar surroundings providing a stark contrast to the corporate conference rooms where the morning's drama had unfolded. Her first question was whether the investigation had revealed the information I'd hoped to discover, and her genuine concern for my emotional well-being touched me in ways I hadn't expected. Explaining the day's events to Vanessa required careful attention to both the professional outcomes and personal costs of our arrangement. The investigation had succeeded in testing our HR policies under realistic conditions, revealing both strengths and areas for improvement in ways that theoretical reviews or consultant analyses never could have accomplished. But it had also created stress and uncertainty for employees who'd participated unknowingly, potentially damaging relationships and trust within the organization in ways that might persist long after the fictional harassment allegations were resolved. Vanessa's reaction to the disciplinary decision was more complex than I'd anticipated. Despite knowing that the entire situation was manufactured, she felt genuinely guilty about the formal reprimand and probationary period that my alter ego would face. Her emotional response highlighted the psychological reality that even fictional harassment allegations carried real consequences for everyone involved. The administrative burden, emotional stress, and professional implications affected people's lives regardless of whether the underlying complaints were genuine or fabricated for experimental purposes. Our conversation extended into the evening as we discussed the next phase of the experiment and how to conclude the investigation in ways that would provide useful organizational insights without causing lasting damage. Vanessa expressed concerns about maintaining the deception much longer, worried that extended false allegations might cross ethical boundaries that we'd managed to avoid so far. Her perspective forced me to confront questions about when legitimate organizational testing became harmful manipulation of unsuspecting employees who'd participated in good faith. The family dinner that followed felt surreal after a day spent receiving disciplinary action for fictional harassment allegations against my own sister. Our mother, Patricia, joined us for a meal where we maintained the fiction that Vanessa was dealing with workplace stress, while I supported her through a difficult professional situation. The normalcy of passing dishes and discussing weekend plans felt bizarre after spending the morning in formal meetings about harassment investigations and workplace discipline. These moments highlighted how completely my experiment had blurred the boundaries between personal relationships and professional responsibilities. Later that evening, I returned to my apartment in Westlake Hills with a sense that the investigation had reached a crucial turning point. The formal disciplinary process was complete, proving that our HR policies functioned effectively under pressure, and that our managers were committed to fair treatment of all employees. But the experiment had also revealed the human cost of harassment allegations, even when they were fabricated for testing purposes. The stress on Casey Thompson, Derek Martinez, and other employees who'd participated unknowingly had been genuine, regardless of the fictional nature of the underlying complaints. Sitting in my home office with Austin's skyline glittering beyond the windows, I began planning how to transition from the investigation phase to the revelation that would eventually expose the experiment's true nature. The challenge was timing the disclosure in ways that would maximize the organizational learning while minimizing the potential damage to relationships and trust within the company. The knowledge I'd gained about our workplace culture, policy effectiveness, and management practices was invaluable, but it had come at a cost that was only beginning to become clear. The evening concluded with phone calls to 3 employment law experts I'd consulted during the planning phases of this experiment. Each conversation focused on the legal and ethical implications of workplace testing that involved deception, particularly when the subjects were employees who hadn't consented to participate in organizational research. Their advice was consistent and sobering. While my intentions were legitimate and the methods weren't illegal, the potential for damaged relationships and lost trust could create long-term problems that outweighed the immediate benefits of improved policies and procedure. Sleep that night was elusive, filled with dreams where conference rooms transformed into courtrooms and HR investigations became criminal trials. The weight of maintaining the deception while processing its implications created a cognitive dissonance that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as I navigated the probationary period Derek had outlined while planning the eventual revelation that would expose the entire experiment to my unsuspecting colleague. The success of the investigation's first phase had proven my company's commitment to workplace safety, but it had also set in motion a series of events that would ultimately test whether that same organization could handle the truth about how its policies had been evaluated. 2 weeks into my probationary period, the cracks in my carefully constructed facade began to show. The mandatory harassment training sessions that Derek had scheduled felt like elaborate theater performances where I sat alongside genuine employees, nodding solemnly as facilitators explained concepts I'd helped develop during the company's policy creation process. The irony of receiving remedial education about workplace respect from consultants I'd personally hired created a cognitive dissonance that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. During one particularly intense session about power dynamics and consent, I caught myself taking notes on my own company's training materials, analyzing their effectiveness from the perspective of someone being disciplined rather than someone who'd approved their implementation. The emotional toll on my colleagues was becoming more apparent with each passing day. Kevin Walsh, the junior designer whose testimony had been crucial to Casey's investigation, approached me in the parking garage after work one evening with an expression that mixed guilt with genuine concern. He explained that he'd been losing sleep over his decision to report the interactions he'd witnessed between Vanessa and me, worried that his testimony might have destroyed someone's career over what could have been simple miscommunication. His moral distress was palpable as he described questioning every workplace interaction, wondering whether his willingness to speak up had been helpful or harmful. The weight of his ethical burden was exactly what I'd hoped to avoid when designing this experiment, yet it seemed inevitable given the realistic nature of the investigation. Kevin's confession revealed layers of workplace dynamics I hadn't fully considered when planning the test. He described feeling pressured to provide testimony that aligned with investigators' expectations, even when his own observations were ambiguous or open to interpretation. The process of formal questioning had transformed his casual memories of team meetings into precise legal statements that carried implications far beyond his original intent. His experience highlighted how harassment investigations could inadvertently coerce well-meaning employees into making definitive statements about situations they'd only partially understood or observed in passing. The conversation in the dimly lit parking garage continued for nearly an hour as Kevin shared his perspective on workplace culture and reporting responsibilities. He explained that many employees avoided documenting concerning behaviors because they feared being drawn into investigations that could consume weeks of their time and emotional energy. His reluctance to get involved in workplace conflicts reflected a broader cultural problem where bystanders chose silence over potential complications, allowing problematic situations to escalate without intervention. These insights were valuable for understanding organizational behavior, but they came at the cost of genuine distress for someone who'd tried to do the right thing based on incomplete information. The following Monday brought an unexpected development that threatened to expose the entire experiment. Tyler Reed, our IT specialist who'd helped create my false employee identity, requested an urgent meeting to discuss what he described as irregularities in the company's personnel database. His technical analysis had revealed inconsistencies in my employment records that didn't align with standard hiring procedures, and his cybersecurity training was making him suspicious about potential data breaches or identity fraud. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday afternoon, giving me less than 24 hours to decide whether to maintain the deception or begin the process of revealing the truth. Lauren Hayes accompanied me to the meeting with Tyler, ostensibly as support for an employee facing additional scrutiny during an already difficult probationary period. The conference room felt smaller than usual as Tyler spread printouts and laptop screens, showing database entries, timestamp discrepancies and reference verification failures that painted a picture of systematic falsification. His presentation was thorough and damning, revealing security vulnerabilities that I'd never considered when creating the fictional employee profile. The technical evidence was so compelling that even I found myself momentarily convinced that someone had infiltrated our systems to plant false information. Tyler's analysis revealed that my fake employment history contained reference phone numbers that connected to disconnected lines, educational credentials that couldn't be verified through standard background check services, and employment dates that overlapped in impossible ways. His cybersecurity expertise had uncovered every shortcut and fabrication that had seemed convincing during the initial setup but crumbled under professional scrutiny. The irony wasn't lost on me that my attempt to test HR policies had exposed genuine security weaknesses in our hiring and verification processes that could have been exploited by actual malicious actors. The technical presentation concluded with Tyler's recommendation for a comprehensive security audit to determine whether other employee records had been compromised and whether the company faced broader risks from potential data breaches or identity theft. His professional obligation to report security concerns had created a situation where maintaining the experiment's secrecy was becoming impossible without actively deceiving someone whose job was protecting the organization from exactly this type of infiltration. The ethical complexity of the situation was escalating beyond anything I'd anticipated when designing the original test. Lauren's intervention during the meeting was masterful, suggesting that the irregularities might be explained by administrative errors during the company's transition to new HR software systems the previous year. Her explanation bought time while acknowledging Tyler's legitimate concerns, but it also required her to participate more actively in the deception than we'd originally planned. The stress of maintaining multiple layers of fiction was affecting everyone involved, creating a web of lies that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain without causing real harm to people who trusted us. That evening, I sat in my home office staring at Tyler's security report while wrestling with the growing conviction that the experiment had run its course. The technical analysis had provided valuable insights about hiring procedures and database security, but it had also demonstrated how quickly legitimate concerns could spiral into investigations that consumed significant organizational resources. The cost of maintaining the deception was approaching the point where it outweighed the benefits of continuing to test our policies under realistic conditions. The decision to begin planning the revelation came during a sleepless Tuesday night when I realized that every additional day of deception increased the potential for lasting damage to relationships and trust within the company. The experiment had successfully tested our harassment reporting procedures, investigation thoroughness, and disciplinary consistency, proving that our policies worked effectively under pressure. But it had also created stress, uncertainty, and moral conflict for employees who'd participated in good faith, and those costs were beginning to outweigh the organizational benefit. Wednesday morning brought the beginning of what I privately called the disclosure phase, though I knew it would be weeks before the full truth could be revealed without causing chaos within the organization. The first step was scheduling a meeting with Derek Martinez to discuss the ongoing concerns about my employment status and the complications Tyler's security analysis had introduced. The conversation would need to balance maintaining operational stability with beginning the process of unwinding the elaborate fiction I'd created. Derek's office felt different when I arrived for our Wednesday afternoon meeting, charged with intention that reflected the accumulating complications surrounding my fictional employee's status. He'd clearly been briefed about Tyler's security concerns, and his expression mixed professional courtesy with genuine worry about the implications for company operations. The folder on his desk was thicker than before, suggesting that the simple harassment investigation had evolved into something more complex and potentially damaging to organizational stability. The conversation began with Derek's explanation of the security review Tyler had recommended, which would involve external consultants examining our entire personnel database to identify potential vulnerabilities or fraudulent entry. The scope of the proposed audit was extensive, requiring significant financial investment and potentially disrupting operations for weeks while investigators verified employee records and system integrity. The practical implications of my experiment were extending far beyond the original harassment investigation, creating ripple effects throughout the organization. Derek's questions about my background and employment history became more pointed as the meeting progressed, reflecting his growing suspicion that something wasn't right about my personnel file. His training in human resources had taught him to recognize inconsistencies that might indicate resume fraud or identity theft, and my fabricated history was displaying exactly the red flags he'd been taught to investigate. The professional skills that made him an effective HR director were now working against my ability to maintain the experimental fiction. The most challenging moment came when Derek asked directly whether I had anything to tell him about irregularities in my employment records or background verification. His question was phrased carefully to give me an opportunity to volunteer information before the formal security audit uncovered it independently. The ethical weight of the moment was enormous as I realized that continuing the deception would require actively lying to someone whose job was protecting the company from exactly the type of fraud my experiment simulated. My response was deliberately ambiguous, acknowledging that there might be documentation issues while stopping short of admitting deliberate falsification. The careful phrasing allowed me to avoid outright lies while maintaining the fiction long enough to plan a controlled revelation that would minimize organizational disruption. Derek's expression suggested that he understood more than he was saying, but his professional obligations required him to follow formal procedures regardless of his personal suspicion. The meeting concluded with Derek's explanation of the timeline for the security audit and his recommendation that I cooperate fully with investigators when they began reviewing employee records. His tone was supportive but firm, reflecting his commitment to helping employees resolve problems while also protecting the organization from potential legal or security risks. The conversation reinforced my growing conviction that the experiment needed to end soon, before good people like Derek were forced to waste additional time and resources on investigations based on fabricated premises. Thursday brought an unexpected complication when Vanessa called to report that other employees had begun asking her questions about our family relationship and whether it had influenced her decision to file harassment complaints. The informal employee network had apparently connected the dots between our shared last name and the ongoing investigation, creating speculation about nepotism, family conflicts, and workplace favoritism that was affecting office dynamics. The social implications of the experiment were extending beyond the formal HR processes into the complex web of interpersonal relationships that defined workplace culture. Vanessa's distress was genuine as she described feeling isolated from colleagues who viewed her with suspicion or sympathy depending on their interpretation of the situation. Some employees had expressed support for her courage in reporting harassment despite family complications, while others questioned whether personal relationships had motivated false allegations designed to manipulate workplace dynamics. The polarization of opinion was creating exactly the type of toxic environment that harassment policies were designed to prevent, demonstrating how investigations could sometimes cause more harm than the original problems they were meant to address. The conversation with Vanessa revealed another unintended consequence of the experiment: the way fictional harassment allegations could damage the credibility of genuine victims who might file future complaints. Several employees had apparently made comments suggesting that family members or friends might fabricate harassment claims to settle personal scores or gain workplace advantage. These attitudes could create barriers for real victims who needed to report actual harassment, making it more difficult for them to be believed or taken seriously by colleagues and management. Friday's staff meeting provided an opportunity to observe the experiment's impact on general workplace morale and communication patterns. The tension in the conference room was palpable as employees navigated conversations about workload distribution, project deadlines, and team responsibilities while carefully avoiding any mention of the ongoing investigation or its participants. The elephant in the room was affecting everyone's ability to communicate naturally, creating an atmosphere of forced professionalism that masked underlying concerns about workplace safety and fairness. During the meeting, I noticed several employees glancing between Vanessa and me with expressions that mixed curiosity with discomfort. The knowledge that family members were involved in a harassment investigation had clearly affected perceptions of workplace dynamics and professional relations. Some colleagues seemed to be walking on eggshells around both of us, uncertain about appropriate boundaries or communication styles in light of the allegations and disciplinary action. The social fabric of the team was showing strain from the prolonged uncertainty about the investigation's implications. The weekend provided time to reflect on the experiment's accomplishments and costs while finalizing plans for the revelation phase that would expose the true nature of the harassment investigation. The test had successfully demonstrated that our HR policies functioned effectively under realistic pressure, that our investigators were thorough and fair, and that our managers were committed to workplace safety. But it had also revealed the human cost of harassment allegations, even when they were fabricated for testing purposes, and the way investigations could create lasting changes in workplace relationships and organizational culture. Sunday evening's planning session with Lauren Hayes focused on developing a communication strategy that would explain the experiment's purpose and methods, while minimizing damage to employee trust and organizational stability. In suburban Phoenix, 43-year-old Sarah Mitchell discovered an old photograph that would unravel her entire reality. What began as spring cleaning became a journey into her past when she noticed something impossible in the background. Before we continue, drop a comment if you've ever experienced déjà vu. The revelation would need to acknowledge the deception while emphasizing the legitimate business purposes that had motivated the test and the valuable insights it had provided about policy effectiveness and workplace culture. The challenge was framing the disclosure in ways that promoted learning rather than cynicism about leadership integrity and organizational transparency. The conversation with Lauren extended late into the evening as we discussed the ethical implications of workplace experimentation and the responsibilities leaders had when testing organizational systems using methods that affected employee well-being. Her perspective was invaluable in helping me understand how the experiment might be perceived by different constituencies within the company, and what steps would be necessary to rebuild trust after the truth was revealed. The process of planning the disclosure forced me to confront the full scope of what I'd undertaken and its potential long-term consequences for my leadership credibility. Monday morning brought the beginning of what I knew would be the final week of the experiment, as the accumulated pressure from security concerns, employee speculation, and my own ethical discomfort made continued deception unsustainable. The harassment investigation had accomplished its primary objectives of testing policy effectiveness and organizational culture, but the secondary effects were threatening to cause more harm than the original learning was worth. The time had come to begin the careful process of revealing the truth while preserving the valuable insights the experiment had provided. The day began with a phone call to Diana Foster, the employment lawyer who'd provided guidance during the planning phases, to discuss legal strategies for disclosing the experiment without creating liability for the company or participant. Her advice was sobering but practical, emphasizing the importance of voluntary disclosure over discovery by external investigators and the need for clear communication about the business purposes that had motivated the testing. The legal implications of workplace experimentation were complex, even when conducted with legitimate organizational goals and careful attention to employee welfare. By Tuesday afternoon, the foundation was laid for a controlled revelation that would begin with key stakeholders and gradually expand to include all affected employees. The process would start with individual conversations with Derek Martinez, Casey Thompson, and Tyler Reed, explaining the experiment's purpose and acknowledging their professional contributions to its success. These discussions would establish the framework for broader organizational communication that would emphasize learning and improvement rather than deception and manipulation. The week ahead would test whether the trust in relationships I'd built over years of leadership could survive the revelation that I'd subjected my own organization to an elaborate experiment designed to test systems I'd personally created. The harassment investigation had proven that our policies worked, but the disclosure phase would determine whether the company culture could handle the truth about how that effectiveness had been measured. The success of the experiment's final phase would ultimately determine whether the knowledge gained justified the methods used to obtain it. The revelation began with Derek Martinez at 8 o'clock on Wednesday morning, in his corner office overlooking downtown Austin. I'd requested the meeting under the pretense of discussing my probationary status, but the manila folder I carried contained documents that would fundamentally alter his understanding of everything that had transpired over the past month. His greeting was cordial but cautious, reflecting the professional distance that had developed between us since the harassment investigation began. The irony of sitting across from him as someone seeking guidance about workplace discipline, when I was actually the person who'd designed the very policies being applied to my fictional situation, created a surreal atmosphere that made every word feel weighted with deception. Derek's expression shifted from professional courtesy to genuine confusion as I began explaining that there were aspects of my employment situation that required clarification before we could proceed with the security audit. Tyler had recommended. His training in human resources had prepared him for many difficult conversations, but nothing in his experience had equipped him to process what I was about to reveal. The folder I opened contained my real employment contract, signed photographs from company events where I appeared as CEO, and board meeting minutes that documented my actual role in creating the harassment policies that had been used to investigate my fictional persona. The silence that followed my initial explanation stretched for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the distant hum of morning traffic 15 floors below. Derek's eyes moved between the documents I'd spread across his desk and my face, as if he were trying to reconcile two completely different versions of reality. The cognitive dissonance was visible in his expression as he processed the implications of what I'd just told him. His first question was barely audible, asking whether I was seriously claiming to be the company's CEO, and his tone suggested he was wondering whether this was some kind of elaborate psychological breakdown rather than a calculated business experiment. The conversation that followed was unlike any I'd experienced in my professional career. Derek's responses moved through stages of disbelief, anger, confusion, and finally a grudging recognition that the evidence I'd presented was too comprehensive to be fabricated. His HR expertise allowed him to verify my claims by cross-referencing the documents with information he could access through his administrative systems, and each confirmation seemed to deepen his sense of betrayal and professional violation. The trust that had developed between us during the investigation process had been built on a foundation of lies, and watching that realization dawn on his face was one of the most difficult moments of the entire experiment. Derek's questions became increasingly pointed as he began to understand the scope of what I'd orchestrated. He wanted to know why I'd chosen to test the company's policies using methods that required deceiving employees who'd acted in good faith, whether I understood the emotional toll the investigation had taken on everyone involved, and how I planned to address the damage to workplace relationships and organizational trust. His anger was controlled but unmistakable, reflecting not just personal betrayal but professional outrage at what he perceived as a manipulation of systems designed to protect vulnerable employees. The most challenging part of the conversation came when Derek asked about Casey Thompson's investigation and whether I understood the professional risks she'd faced in reaching conclusions about allegations that were entirely fictional. His concern for his colleague's reputation and career prospects was deeply felt, and he pointed out that Casey's thorough and fair investigation could have been compromised if external reviewers discovered that her work had been based on manufactured evidence. The implications for her professional standing in the employment law community were significant, and Derek's protective instincts toward his team member added another layer of complexity to the ethical questions surrounding my experiment. Derek's response to my explanations about the business purposes behind the test was skeptical and increasingly frustrated. While he acknowledged that the experiment had revealed valuable insights about policy effectiveness and organizational culture, he questioned whether those benefits justified the methods I'd used to obtain them. His perspective as someone who'd invested significant time and emotional energy in what he'd believed was a legitimate harassment investigation made him particularly sensitive to the costs of deception, even when conducted with ostensibly legitimate business purpose. The conversation gradually shifted from emotional processing to practical considerations about how to manage the situation moving forward. Derek's HR expertise was invaluable in helping me understand the potential legal and operational implications of the disclosure, and his recommendations for addressing employee concerns reflected his deep understanding of workplace dynamics and organizational psychology. Despite his anger about the deception, his commitment to protecting the company and its employees remained paramount, and his advice about managing the revelation process was both practical and ethically sound. The meeting concluded with Derek's agreement to delay the security audit Tyler had recommended while we developed a comprehensive communication strategy for revealing the truth about the experiment to all affected parties. His condition for this cooperation was that I personally take responsibility for explaining the situation to Casey Thompson, and that I provide written acknowledgement of the professional risks my actions had created for everyone involved in the investigation. The weight of accountability was settling on my shoulders in ways I'd intellectually understood but hadn't fully emotionally prepared for when designing the experiment. The afternoon brought the even more difficult conversation with Casey Thompson, whose professional reputation and investigative integrity had been unwittingly compromised by my elaborate deception. Her office was smaller than Derek's, filled with legal texts and employment law references that testified to her expertise in the field where I'd essentially tricked her into conducting fictitious research. The manila folder I carried contained not only the same documentation I'd shown Derek, but also a formal letter acknowledging my responsibility for any professional damage that might result from the revelation that her investigation had been based on fabricated allegations. Casey's reaction to my disclosure was more complex than Derek's, reflecting her background in employment law and her understanding of the broader implications for harassment investigations and victim advocacy. Her initial response was professional skepticism, asking detailed questions about the documentation I'd provided and cross-referencing my claims with information she could independently verify. Her investigative instincts were as sharp in this situation as they had been during the harassment review, and she applied the same methodical approach to evaluating my revelations that she'd used to assess Vanessa's original complaint. The conversation became increasingly intense as Casey began to understand the full scope of what I'd done and its potential impact on her professional stand. Her expertise in employment law made her acutely aware of how the disclosure might affect her reputation within the legal community, particularly if word spread that she'd conducted a thorough investigation based on entirely fictional allegations. The possibility that colleagues might question her judgment or investigative skills, even though she'd followed proper procedures throughout the process, was a source of significant professional anxiety. Casey's questions about the experiment's methodology revealed her deep understanding of the ethical complexities involved in workplace research and organizational testing. She pointed out that legitimate studies of harassment reporting and investigation procedures typically required informed consent from participants and oversight from institutional review boards, protections that were designed to prevent exactly the type of deception I'd employed. Her perspective as someone trained in legal ethics added another dimension to the moral questions surrounding my experiment. The most difficult moment of the conversation came when Casey asked whether I truly understood the potential harm that could result from my actions, not just to the individuals who'd been deceived, but to the broader cause of workplace harassment prevention. Her concern was that if news of the experiment became public, it might undermine confidence in harassment reporting systems and make genuine victims more reluctant to come forward with legitimate complaints. The possibility that my test of organizational policies might inadvertently damage the very systems it was designed to improve was a consequence I hadn't fully considered during the planning phases. Casey's response to my explanations about the business justifications for the experiment was measured but critical. While she acknowledged that the test had revealed valuable information about policy effectiveness and organizational culture, she questioned whether the insights gained were worth the potential damage to trust and credibility within the field of employment law. Her professional network included advocates and attorneys who dedicated their careers to protecting workplace harassment victims, and she was concerned about how they might react to news that a CEO had orchestrated fake allegations to test corporate policy. The conversation concluded with Casey's agreement to maintain confidentiality about the experiment while I developed a comprehensive plan for addressing its implications and communicating with all affected parties. Her condition for this cooperation was that I commit to transparently documenting the entire process, including its costs and consequences, in ways that could contribute to legitimate research about organizational behavior and policy effectiveness. Her suggestion that the experiment's results might have scholarly value, despite the problematic methods used to obtain them, offered a potential path toward making the knowledge gained available to other organizations without requiring them to employ similar deceptive tactics. The evening brought the most personally challenging conversation of the day, as I met with Tyler Reed to explain the security concerns he'd identified and their relationship to the experiment I'd conducted. His expertise in cybersecurity and database management had uncovered every flaw in the fake employee profile I'd created, and his professional obligations to report potential security breaches had created a situation where maintaining the deception was becoming impossible. The technical evidence he'd compiled was so thorough that it would have inevitably exposed the truth even if I hadn't chosen to reveal it voluntarily. Tyler's reaction to my disclosure was unique among the three key stakeholders, reflecting his background in technology rather than human resources or employment law. His primary concern was not the ethical implications of the experiment, but the security vulnerabilities it had revealed in the company's hiring and verification process. From his perspective, The fake employee profile had served as a penetration test of our personnel systems, identifying weaknesses that could be exploited by actual malicious actors attempting to infiltrate the organization through identity fraud or resume falsification. The technical discussion that followed was both illuminating and sobering, as Tyler explained how easily the security measures I'd thought were sufficient had been circumvented during the creation of my fictional identity. His analysis revealed gaps in background verification, reference checking, and database cross-referencing that could potentially allow genuine bad actors to gain employment under false pretense. The experiment had inadvertently served as a comprehensive security audit, identifying systemic vulnerabilities that needed immediate attention to protect the organization from real threats. Tyler's recommendations for addressing the security issues went far beyond simply removing my fake employee profile from the system. He outlined a comprehensive review of hiring procedures, background verification protocols, and database security measures that would require significant investment in new systems and training programs. The cost of implementing his recommendations would be substantial, but his analysis made it clear that the vulnerabilities existed regardless of my experiment and needed to be addressed whether or not I'd conducted the harassment investigation. The conversation with Tyler also revealed an unexpected benefit of the experiment that I hadn't anticipated during the planning phase. His security analysis had identified not only the weaknesses in our hiring procedures, but also several strengths in our database management and access control systems that had prevented unauthorized individuals from gaining broader access to sensitive information. The technical safeguards that had contained the experiment's impact demonstrated that our cybersecurity investments were functioning effectively, even though our identity verification processes needed improvement. Thursday morning brought the beginning of a broader communication process that would eventually include all employees affected by the experiment. The first step was a meeting with the company's board of directors to explain the situation and seek their guidance on managing the disclosure process. The boardroom atmosphere was tense as I presented the same documentation I'd shown to Derek, Casey, and Tyler, knowing that their reaction would significantly influence how the experiment's revelation was perceived by other stakeholders. The board's response was mixed, reflecting the diverse backgrounds and perspectives of the directors who'd been elected to provide oversight and guidance for the company's operation. Some members expressed appreciation for the innovative approach to testing organizational policies, while others questioned the ethics of deceiving employees and the potential legal risks associated with the experiment. The discussion that followed was thorough and sometimes contentious, as directors wrestled with the complex implications of approving retroactive endorsement of actions that had been taken without their prior knowledge or consent. The legal implications of the experiment were a primary concern for several board members, who worried about potential liability for the company if affected employees decided to pursue legal action based on the deception. The board's legal counsel provided analysis of the potential risks, noting that while the experiment didn't appear to violate any specific laws, it did raise questions about employment practices and workplace research that could become problematic if mishandled during the disclosure process. The recommendation was for complete transparency about the experiment's methods and purposes, coupled with proactive efforts to address any concerns raised by affected employees. The board's ultimate decision was to support a carefully managed disclosure process that would prioritize transparency and accountability while protecting the company's interests and employee relationships. Their endorsement came with specific conditions about how the revelation would be communicated, what steps would be taken to address any negative consequences, and how the insights gained from the experiment would be used to improve organizational policies and procedures. The framework they established provided structure for the comprehensive communication strategy that would unfold over the following weeks. Friday brought the most emotionally challenging conversation of the entire process, as I sat down with Vanessa to discuss the ending of her role in the experiment and the transition to public disclosure about what we'd accomplished. Her participation had been crucial to the test's success, but the emotional toll of maintaining the deception for over a month was evident in her expression as we met in the same coffee shop where we'd originally planned the experiment. The weight of keeping such a significant secret while watching its impact on unsuspecting colleagues had created stress that was affecting her sleep, appetite, and overall well-being. Vanessa's questions about the disclosure process reflected her concerns about how colleagues would react to learning that she'd participated in an elaborate deception designed to test company policy. Her worry was that coworkers might view her as untrustworthy or manipulative, even though her participation had been motivated by legitimate business purposes rather than personal gain. The social implications of the experiment were particularly challenging for her, as someone who would continue working at the company after the truth was revealed, and who would need to rebuild relationships with colleagues who'd been unknowingly involved in the investigation. The conversation with Vanessa also revealed her perspective on the experiment's impact on workplace culture and employee relationships. Her observations about how the investigation had affected team dynamics, communication patterns, and social interactions provided valuable insights that complemented the more formal feedback from HR professionals and investigators. Her experience as someone who'd observed the experiment's effects from within the affected work groups offered a unique perspective on the human costs and benefits of the organizational testing we'd conducted. The weekend was spent finalizing the comprehensive communication plan that would guide the disclosure process over the following weeks. The strategy included individual meetings with directly affected employees, department-level presentations for broader context, and company-wide communications that would explain the experiment's purposes and results. The timeline was carefully structured to allow for processing and questions at each level, while maintaining operational stability during what would inevitably be a period of significant organizational adjustment. The communication plan also included provisions for external stakeholders who might be affected by news of the experiment, including clients, vendors, and industry contacts who worked with the company. The potential for negative publicity required careful consideration of how to frame the disclosure in ways that emphasized the legitimate business purposes and positive outcomes, while acknowledging the controversial methods that had been employed. The goal was to position the experiment as an innovative approach to organizational improvement, rather than a deceptive manipulation of employee trust. Sunday evening brought a final planning session with Lauren Hayes, Derek Martinez, and Casey Thompson to coordinate the disclosure process that would begin Monday morning. The meeting felt different from previous conversations, as we were no longer maintaining the fiction that had defined our interactions for the past month. The shift to honest communication about the experiment's objectives and implications was both liberating and sobering, as we prepared to help the organization process the truth about what had been accomplished and how it had been achieved. The planning session focused on anticipating potential employee reactions and developing strategies for addressing the concerns that were likely to arise during the disclosure process. The team's collective expertise in human resources, employment law, and organizational psychology was invaluable in preparing for the complex conversations that would unfold as more people learned about the experiment. The goal was to create opportunities for honest dialogue about the ethical and practical implications of the test, while maintaining focus on the valuable insights it had provided about policy effectiveness and workplace culture. As the weekend concluded, I reflected on the transformation that had occurred over the past month, both in my understanding of the organization I'd built and in my appreciation for the complexity of workplace relationships and trust. The experiment had successfully tested our harassment policies and revealed important insights about organizational behavior, but it had also forced me to confront difficult questions about leadership ethics and the responsibilities that came with the power to shape other people's work experience. The disclosure process that would begin Monday morning would ultimately determine whether the knowledge gained justified the methods used to obtain it, and whether the organization could emerge stronger from the experience of being tested in ways its employees had never imagined. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability, as I prepared to address the entire company about an experiment that had tested not just our policies, but the very foundation of trust upon which our workplace culture was built. The all-hands meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the main conference room, with video connections for remote employees who worked from satellite offices across Texas. The presentation materials I'd prepared over the weekend contained charts, graphs, and detailed analysis that documented every aspect of the experiment's methodology and results, but no amount of data could soften the emotional impact of revealing that their CEO had orchestrated an elaborate deception involving their colleagues and friends. The conference room filled slowly as employees filtered in with the casual conversation that typically preceded company meetings, but I could sense an underlying tension that suggested rumors had already begun circulating about the purpose of this gathering. Lauren Hayes had positioned herself near the front, her expression supportive but serious, while Derek Martinez sat with his HR team toward the middle of the room. Casey Thompson had chosen a seat near the back, her legal training probably making her want to observe reactions without being the center of attention. The diverse group of marketing professionals, software developers, administrative staff, and managers represented the community I'd built over years of careful hiring and team development, and they deserved to understand what had been done in the name of organizational improvement. I began the presentation with a direct acknowledgement that what I was about to reveal would fundamentally change how they understood recent events within the company. The harassment investigation that had affected team dynamics and workplace relationships for the past month had been conducted under circumstances that no one except a few key individuals had fully understood. The silence that followed this opening was complete, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning system and the distant sounds of downtown Austin traffic filtering through the conference room window. The revelation that I was not actually Natalie Chen, a marketing coordinator facing disciplinary action for harassment allegations, but rather Natalie Brooks, their CEO and company founder, created a wave of visible confusion that rippled through the assembled employees. Some people leaned forward in their chairs, as if physical proximity would help them process what they were hearing, while others sat back with expressions that mixed disbelief with growing comprehension. The cognitive dissonance was palpable as individuals tried to reconcile their memories of interactions with someone they'd believed was a colleague in trouble with the reality that this person had actually been their organizational leader conducting an elaborate test. Kevin Walsh's face went pale as he realized the implications of his testimony during the investigation, understanding that his willingness to report concerning behavior had been manipulated for experimental purposes. His visible distress was a stark reminder of the human cost of the deception, and I made a point of acknowledging his integrity and professionalism throughout the process. The guilt I felt about involving him and others in fabricated situations was overwhelming, but I knew that honest recognition of these costs was essential for beginning the process of rebuilding trust within the organization. The presentation continued with detailed documentation of the experiment's methodology, including the creation of false employment records, the coordination with Vanessa to develop believable harassment allegations, and the systematic testing of HR policies under realistic conditions. Each revelation seemed to deepen the complexity of reactions throughout the room, as employees processed not just the facts of what had occurred, but the implications for their understanding of workplace relationships and organizational transparency. The charts and graphs that documented policy effectiveness and cultural insights felt inadequate to capture the emotional impact of learning that their professional environment had been used as a laboratory for leadership experiment. The questions that followed the presentation were thoughtful and sometimes painful, reflecting the deep investment that employees had made in the company's success and their genuine concern for workplace safety and fairness. Maria Santos, a senior developer who'd been with the company for 4 years, asked whether the experiment had been worth the stress and uncertainty it had created for everyone involved. Her question went to the heart of the ethical dilemma that had driven the entire project, and my response required honest acknowledgement that the benefits of improved policy understanding came at significant personal and professional costs for many people. James Mitchell, a content strategist who'd worked closely with Vanessa, raised concerns about the precedent that might be set by conducting workplace experiments without employee consent or knowledge. His perspective reflected broader questions about the boundaries of acceptable organizational research and the responsibilities that leaders had to maintain transparency with their team. The discussion that followed his question was extensive, as employees expressed varying views about the balance between innovation in organizational management, respect for individual autonomy, and consent. The most challenging question came from Sandra Torres, an HR coordinator who'd assisted with various aspects of the investigation without knowing its true nature. She asked whether I understood the potential damage that could result if news of the experiment became public, particularly for the company's reputation and for the broader cause of workplace harassment prevention. Her concern was that the revelation might undermine confidence in harassment reporting systems and make genuine victims more reluctant to come forward with legitimate complaints. The possibility that my test of organizational policies might inadvertently damage the very systems it was designed to improve was a consequence that weighed heavily on my conscience. The presentation concluded with a detailed discussion of the insights gained from the experiment and the specific improvements that would be implemented based on what had been learned. The policy changes included enhanced training programs, improved communication protocols, and stronger support systems for employees involved in harassment investigation. The security vulnerabilities that Tyler had identified would be addressed through comprehensive updates to hiring procedures and database management systems. The cultural issues that had been revealed would be tackled through team-building initiatives and leadership development programs designed to strengthen trust and communication throughout the organization. The afternoon brought individual meetings with employees who'd been most directly affected by the experiment, providing opportunities for private conversations about their experiences and concerns. These sessions were emotionally intense, as people shared their perspectives on what it had felt like to be unwittingly involved in an elaborate deception, even one conducted with legitimate business purposes. The feedback was mixed, with some employees expressing appreciation for the innovative approach to organizational improvement, while others questioned whether the benefits justified the methods that had been employed. The meeting with Kevin Walsh was particularly difficult, as he described the sleepless nights he'd experienced after providing testimony about interactions he'd witnessed between Vanessa and my fictional persona. His moral distress about potentially damaging someone's career had been genuine, and learning that his ethical concerns had been manipulated for experimental purposes created a complex mix of relief and betrayal. The conversation required careful attention to his emotional well-being while also acknowledging the valuable insights his participation had provided about bystander behavior and reporting responsibility. The conversation with Sandra Torres revealed the perspective of someone who'd been professionally involved in the investigation without understanding its true nature. Her expertise in HR procedures had contributed to the experiment's success, but her unwitting participation raised questions about informed consent and professional ethics that extended beyond the immediate workplace. The discussion that followed was thoughtful and sometimes contentious, as we explored the boundaries of acceptable organizational research and the responsibilities that leaders had to maintain transparency with their team. The week continued with department-level meetings that provided opportunities for broader discussions about the experiment's implications and the changes that would be implemented based on its results. These sessions were less emotionally charged than the individual conversations, but they revealed important insights about workplace culture and employee expectations that informed the ongoing process of organizational improvement. The feedback from these meetings was incorporated into revised policies and procedures that reflected both the technical insights gained from the experiment and the human concerns that had been raised during the disclosure process. The most significant outcome of the disclosure process was the establishment of an employee advisory council that would provide ongoing input about organizational policies and procedures. This body, composed of representatives from different departments and levels within the company, would serve as a check on leadership decisions and ensure that future changes to workplace policies were developed with genuine employee input and consent. The Council's charter included specific provisions for reviewing any proposed research or testing that might affect employee well-being or workplace relationships. The media attention that eventually surrounded the experiment was more extensive than I'd anticipated, with coverage ranging from business publications interested in innovative management techniques to legal journals concerned about the ethical implications of workplace research. The publicity was generally balanced, acknowledging both the valuable insights that had been gained and the controversial methods that had been employed. The coverage also sparked broader conversations about organizational transparency, employee consent, and the responsibilities of leadership in modern workplaces. The long-term impact of the experiment extended far beyond the immediate organizational changes that were implemented based on its results. The company's reputation for innovative management practices attracted attention from other organizations interested in improving their own workplace policies, leading to consulting opportunities and speaking engagements that shared the lessons learned from the experiment. The academic interest in the experiment's methodology and results led to collaborations with researchers studying organizational behavior and workplace harassment prevention. The personal impact of the experiment was equally significant, fundamentally changing my understanding of leadership responsibility and the complexity of workplace relationships. The experience of deceiving good people who trusted me even for legitimate business purposes created a lasting appreciation for the importance of transparency and consent in organizational decision-making. The success of the experiment in testing policy effectiveness was overshadowed by the recognition that similar insights could have been gained through methods that didn't require deception or manipulation of employee trust. The relationship with Vanessa emerged stronger from the experience, as our collaboration in conducting the experiment had required unprecedented levels of trust and communication. Her willingness to participate in the deception despite its personal costs demonstrated a commitment to organizational improvement that went beyond family loyalty. The stress of maintaining the elaborate fiction had been significant for both of us, but the successful completion of the experiment provided a shared sense of accomplishment that strengthened our professional and personal relationship. The experiment's ultimate vindication came through the improved workplace culture and policy effectiveness that resulted from the insights gained during the testing process. Employee satisfaction surveys conducted 6 months after the disclosure showed significant improvements in trust, communication, and confidence in organizational leadership. The harassment reporting system that had been tested under fictional conditions proved more effective when genuine situations arose, as the training and procedural improvements had addressed the gaps that had been identified during the experiment. The ethical questions raised by the experiment continued to influence organizational decision-making long after the immediate controversy had subsided. The Employee Advisory Council that had been established in response to concerns about consent and transparency became a model for other organizations seeking to improve their own workplace governance. The ongoing dialogue about the boundaries of acceptable organizational research contributed to broader conversations about leadership responsibility and employee rights in modern workplaces. As I reflected on the entire experience months later, the complexity of its legacy was clear. The experiment had successfully tested organizational policies under realistic conditions, revealing valuable insights about workplace culture and management effectiveness. But it had also demonstrated the human cost of deception even when conducted with legitimate business purposes, and the importance of maintaining trust and transparency in organizational relations. The knowledge gained had been valuable, but the methods used to obtain it had raised questions about leadership ethics that would influence organizational decision-making for years to come. The final judgment about the experiment's worth ultimately belonged to the employees who had been affected by it, and their responses remained mixed long after the disclosure process had concluded. Some viewed it as an innovative approach to organizational improvement that had led to meaningful positive changes in workplace culture and policy effectiveness. Others saw it as a violation of trust that had damaged relationships and created unnecessary stress for people who had acted in good faith throughout the process. The diversity of perspectives reflected the complexity of the ethical questions that the experiment had raised, and the lasting impact it would have on everyone involved. The story of the experiment became a case study in business schools and organizational psychology programs, used to teach students about the ethical complexities of workplace research and the responsibilities of leadership in modern organizations. The academic interest in the methodology and results provided opportunities to share the lessons learned with future managers and leaders, potentially preventing similar ethical dilemmas in other organizations. The legacy of the experiment extended far beyond the immediate organizational benefits, contributing to broader conversations about consent, transparency, and accountability in workplace relations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.